In today's session, we will be starting off with a new chapter and we will be having a discussion about overhead cost control. In the previous sessions, we had got an understanding about what is overhead. We also classified overhead as a part of the first chapter. In this chapter, we would be learning a little bit more in detail about what is overhead and how can you go about controlling overhead in an organization. So to start off with, let us try and understand what is meant by the term overhead. Today's session, we would be starting off by discussing what is meant by overhead. So overhead can be defined as the aggregate of indirect material cost, indirect wages, and indirect expenses. So sum total of all the material cost, wages, and expenses in an organization is what you call as the overhead. So what is overhead? Overhead is the sum total of indirect material, indirect wages, and indirect expenses. So when we discussed each of these topics in detail, we had touched upon some of these areas one by one. We had discussed when we discussed the chapter on material cost control, we had discussed in detail what is material, what is direct material. When we spoke about labor, we spoke about direct labor, etc. In this session, we would be focusing exclusively on what is meant by overhead. So our thrust, our focus in this chapter, it would be what is meant by overhead. So with that note, let us have a little bit more detailed discussion about what is overhead. To talk a little bit about overhead, the cost of indirect material, indirect labor, and such other expenses, including services which cannot be conveniently charged to a specific cost unit. Now, there are certain costs that you have in your organization which cannot be tagged against a specific area, or it cannot be tagged against a specific product, it cannot be tagged against a specific service. So it becomes very difficult. So I'll give you a very simple example. Back at home, when we carry out cooking of different dishes, there are some material that we are able to quantify. So for example, if you want to make a chicken curry at home, you know for sure you have to buy 1 kg of chicken. But there are certain ingredients which goes into the same curry which cannot be quantified specifically to that dish that you're preparing. So for example would be salt. Salt that you're consuming as a part of your cooking process, you would not be able to entirely quantify and then associate and say this salt is associated with this area. So that is what is referred to as the overhead. So overhead is defined as the indirect material, indirect labor, and other expenses which include services that cannot be specifically quantified against the cost unit. Now, you cannot allocate overheads against a specific cost center. You cannot quantify and say this is from a specific cost center. So I think there's something wrong with my system. So I think I've got it back over here. So it cannot be allocated against a specific cost center. When we touched upon the earlier sessions, we saw that in organizations, we would define cost centers. What is a cost center? Cost center is the smallest segment in an organization which is utilized to measure cost. So you cannot associate and say that this cost that you're incurring, it is from this specific cost center. That becomes very difficult. However, these costs still exist in your organization. These costs are inevitable. Without them, you cannot continue to function smoothly. It is a part and parcel of your continuous activity of rendering services or producing products. Now, what do you do with this overhead? The overheads have to be apportioned and absorbed. Either it has to be apportioned or it has to be absorbed based on certain suitable methods. So here's what happens. You have overhead. Overhead is a cost, but this cost you cannot tag against a specific, you will not be able to tag against a specific cost center or a cost unit. It needs to be apportioned, it needs to be absorbed. So this chapter, we would be learning how do we go about with that activity. Okay, as a part of this chapter, we would be learning how do we go about carrying out these activities of getting the overhead back. Now, classification of overheads. Overheads can be broadly classified into two. You have direct cost and then you have indirect cost. Okay, I'll repeat that once again. Classification of overhead, you can broadly classify into two. You have direct cost and then you have indirect cost. So we've already touched upon some of these areas of direct material, direct labor. We had learned in the previous chapters. So this entire chapter, we would be focusing on this aspect, that is indirect material, indirect labor, and then indirect expenses. So this is one way that we can go about classifying overheads in an organization. Now, another way that we can look at a classification of overheads is like this. You can broadly classify overheads on three basic parameters. Overheads can be broadly classified into three. You can have a classification based on function, you can have a classification based on behavior, and then you can have a classification based on element. I'll repeat that. Whenever you talk about overhead in an organization, this same overhead can be classified into on the basis of three aspects, on the basis of three parameters. You have function, you have behavior, and then you have element. Let's touch upon each of these one by one. First is function. So function classification, how do you go about? Okay, function classification, how do you go about? So based on function, you can classify them into three. You have production, admin, selling, distribution, and R&D. I'll repeat that. You have production, admin, selling, distribution, and then research and development. So this is the classification based on function. Then you have behavior. So based on behavior, you can classify them into fixed, variable, semi-variable. I'll repeat that. Based on behavior, you can classify them into three. You have fixed, variable, and then you have semi-variable. Then based on element, you have three. You have material, labor, and then you have expenses. Now we will be discussing some of these classifications in detail. The first classification that we will be talking is based on function. The first classification that we would be learning is based on function. So based on function, overhead can be further classified into five. You have production, admin, selling, distribution, research and development. If you go back to most of the textbooks, they will be talking about four functional classifications that includes production, admin, selling, distribution. Not many of them would include R&D, but in present context, in the context of the present pandemic, I feel R&D as when you look at R&D, it may not yield any benefit to you directly, but it is still an overhead, but at the same time, it is vital. It is equally important. It is equally vital as well for the survival of any organization. So in that line, let us talk about the classification of overhead based on these five aspects. Let's touch upon them one by one. So first classification is based on function, and I told you there are four major functions. There are based on function, there are primarily four major classifications. The fifth one I'll be sharing with you as a bonus. So here goes. The first one is production overhead. So when you talk about production overhead, it is also known as factory overhead. I'll repeat that. Production overhead, it is also known as factory overhead. Now, what do you basically mean by production overhead? So production overhead, what you have to remember is it is associated with your production department. It is associated with your production activity. As a part of your organization, you'll be carrying out certain functions, you'll be carrying out certain production activities. So based on that, you have this classification. Now, the material, this cannot be measured directly. Okay? You cannot quantify this directly. So some of the examples are depreciation, maintenance, etc. Now, depreciation that you charge for some of your assets, you may not be able to quantify it directly. Whereas there are some assets that you can pinpoint. So, for example, you have machineries depreciation. You will be able to associate that depreciation on machinery directly with the activity for which that machinery is used for. Okay, so in such cases, it becomes very easy. But at the same time, you may have depreciation on your building, and your building, you may be producing 10 or 15 different products. So in such cases, how do you go about distributing depreciation? So in such cases, this becomes very difficult. This becomes very difficult in the case of certain assets. So in the case of certain assets, what happens is the measurement of depreciation becomes very easy because you're able to tangibly quantify against a specific area and then say this is associated with such and such area. So that's what happens in the case of production overhead. Then you have administration overhead. Administration overhead, this is the overhead that you incur in terms of carrying out your administrational activities. So it has something to do with your control and the management of your functioning of your organization. Administration overhead, it is associated with control and then management of your organization. So some examples of administration related overheads that you can have are stationery, printing, etc. These are some of the administration overheads that you can have. The next thing is selling overhead. Okay, the next is selling overhead. So when you talk about selling overhead, we are talking about the money that you're spending for creating a demand. You're trying to induce a demand among your consumers. You're trying to create a demand among your customers. Why are you spending this money? You're spending this money with an anticipation that you will be getting more visibility, you'll be getting more orders. So some examples would be, you'll be carrying out some kind of promotional activities. You may be distributing flyers, you may be giving some free samples. So for example, yesterday I just happened to walk into a nearby vegetable store, and there was a company that has come forward. They're supplying ready to cook idli batters, and the company was giving 1 liter of idli batter free of cost. So now, why are they doing that? Because you have to remember the batter market is already saturated. You have prominent players like ID, then you have Asal. So these brands, they're already existing there. They are already very prominent in this segment. So any new player who's trying to come in, they're trying to compete against them. So how do they sustain competition? So they sustain competition by introducing their brand and positioning the brand in a specific way before their customers. So that's the reason why they would end up spending money. So some examples would be showroom rent, promotional activities, etc. All these will fall under selling overhead. Then you have distribution overhead. What do you mean by distribution overhead? Distribution overhead refers to the cost that your firm is incurring in terms of logistics. In order to ensure that the end product or service reaches the customer, reaches your end customer, reaches the person who's enjoying the benefit, you may incur some kind of cost, and that cost is referred to as distribution overhead. Okay, that cost is what we call as distribution overhead. So some examples are delivery charges. Okay, so in the case of certain businesses, this may be very important. This may be a very vital. So, for example, if you look at Swiggy, as a business, they may have an overhead in terms of maintaining the app. So the mobile app from which you would place your orders, it needs to be updated periodically. Okay? But that's an overhead. Why? Because it has got nothing to do with directly with your entire activity of picking up the order from the hotel and delivering it to your end customer. But if you do not do so, it may hamper with your survival. It may disturb your organizational existence. So that's about distribution overhead. Then you have R&D overhead, research and development overhead. So this refers to the cost that you incur for developing. Now, when you look at R&D, there are two ways that you have to look at R&D. Research and development cost that you're incurring, it is to develop new products. Okay? So you may be incurring some kind of expenses to develop new product. At the same time, you may be incurring costs to streamline and enhance your existing products as well. So there are two aspects. One is where you are incurring some cost in developing new products. The second is you are incurring some kind of cost in improvising your existing product. So you already have a product line, you want to improve, you want to make it better. and the cost that you incur for that is what you call as R&D, what you would refer to as research and development. Now, in the present pandemic situation, I feel this overhead we have to touch upon as a part of a discussion, because in the present scenario, this is very vital. This is very important, because if you look at the present pandemic situation for COVID, we do not have a perfect treatment, neither do we have a vaccine. So what are pharma companies basically doing right now? Pharma companies are basically spending a lot of money in terms of developing a new product. If they're trying to develop a new product to overcome the present pandemic situation. Now, we would have read in the news space about so many candidates, so many vaccine trials which are going on now. So, for example, you have the Oxford University's trial which is going on. You have the Serum Institute of India, their trial is going on. You have AstraZeneca who are carrying out their trials. So you have different players who are carrying out these trials. But it doesn't mean that all of them will be successful. But why is the company still burning money? The reason why the company is still burning money is because unless and until they do, the person who gets a cure, who's in a position to develop a treatment for this, they would be able to gain a monopoly. So everyone is trying to keep up the hand and keep up with the race. So that is the reason why R&D is very critical. That's the reason why R&D is very important. But at the same time, you have a lot of money which is being spent in terms of improving the existing products. So if you look at in terms of in the pharma company itself, they may already have some treatments which are readily available, but you're trying to enhance the existing product. You're trying to bring out variants to that. So that is the reason why you're trying to improve your existing product. Now, sometimes what happens is the money that you have to spend for your R&D, it would run into a few dollars altogether. It is really expensive. So unless and until you spend money for this, it may not prove to be futile. So that's the reason why R&D is also very important. The next classification that we would be learning is based on element. We know that there are three elements of cost. The three elements of cost are material, labor, and then expenses. We know there are three elements of cost. The three elements of cost are material, labor, and then expenses. Now, let's talk about this classification. Now, the classification based on element. When we talk about element, we're talking about the source. We're talking about the nature. So the first classification that we have is material. So in material overhead, we're talking about indirect material. Okay, we're talking about indirect material. So indirect material there are certain material which would be a direct part of your end product, and you're able to quantify it has got a fixed cost that is associated with it. But at the same time, you have certain materials which are consumed as a part of your production process, and it may not have a direct correlation with your production process. So some examples would be consumables. So I want all of you probably to observe this. Next time when you give your vehicle for servicing and when your vehicle comes back, there would be something which is called as consumables that they would be adding. So for example, they found a screw missing, or they found a nut missing, they found a washer missing. So in such cases, it is referred to as consumables. So consumables is a part of an indirect material. So we can pick up on some other examples. So for example, when you go for stitching of a shirt, okay, in order to stitch the shirt, you may need certain components like cloth, button, thread, etc. So if you ask the tailor to stitch a shirt, how much of cloth is needed, he may be able to tell you exactly. 1.5 meters of cloth is needed. But if you ask him how many meters of thread is needed, that he may not be able to give you an exact figure. Why? Because thread is an indirect material which is consumed by the tailor. The thread that is used by the tailor, that is an example of an indirect material. Moving on, we have indirect wages. Okay, moving on, next thing that we will be talking about is the indirect wages. What do you mean by indirect wages? Indirect wages refers to the labor that is involved as a part of your production process. It may not be absorbed it cannot be absorbed directly. So for example, office pew. So for the office pew, you may have to pay a remuneration. You will have to pay him salary, but his contributions to the entire functioning of the office or the entire functioning of the business, you may not be able to specifically say. You may not be able to specifically say. So I'll just give you an example. The other day I walked into a car showroom for some clerical activities, and there was this time that I needed some Xerox. So what the person with whom I was discussing, he called the peon. He asked him to go take Xerox and come back. Now that peon is paid some salary. If he's not there, then that office may not function smoothly. But his contribution to the overall activities happening in that business, you may not be able to quantify and say specifically. Okay, so such kind of remunerations, the remuneration that you pay for such categories of your labor class, that you call as indirect wages. Then you have indirect expenses. Indirect expenses are expenses that you incur. These are expenses that you cannot avoid, but unless and until you incur these kind of expenses as well, your business may not be able to function smoothly. So some examples are interest on loan. You wanted to start a business, you didn't have money with you, so you decide to take a loan. But when you take the loan, what happens is you have to pay interest to the financial company, the financial institution from where you have taken the loan. Now that loan that you have taken is an indirect expense for you. Okay, so for example, you took a loan to start a hotel. Okay? You took a loan to start a hotel. Okay? But when you were starting the hotel, in your hotel you have different dishes. Okay? You may have masala dosa, you may have plain dosa, you may have vada, you may have idli. You have different dishes. Okay, so the interest that you have taken on, the interest that you're paying on the loan to start the business, you may not be able to distribute and say, okay, so this percentage, I'm paying 1,000 rupees as interest on my loan. Out of this 1,000 rupees, 100 rupees should come from my vada, 50 rupees should come from idli. You will not be able to distribute in that manner. Why? Because it is an expense that you're incurring. You're not able to quantify against a specific activity, against a specific product. That's why it is called as an indirect expense. So based on element, you have three classifications. You have indirect material, indirect wages, and then indirect expenses. Now, the next classification that we have is based on behavior. So based on behavior of the cost, you have three classifications. You have fixed, variable, and semi-variable. I'll repeat that. Based on behavior, you have three classifications. You have fixed, variable, and then semi-variable. So basically, we are talking about in what way does this cost of this expense behave. So in that line, you have what is called as fixed cost or fixed overhead. Fixed overhead, no matter whatever you do, it will remain fixed. It will remain fixed. So for example, rent that you pay for your premises, that is an overhead fee. It is a fixed overhead fee. Now, no matter whatever you do, what kind of activities you carry out, this component of overhead that you have, it will remain the same. It will remain fixed. Okay? So that is what is called as fixed overhead. Then you have variable overhead. Okay? Then you have variable overhead. So variable overhead, what happens is, in the case of variable overhead, the overhead cost will vary depending on the level of output. So for example, raw material. Then you have semi-variable. So in the case of semi-variable overhead, what will happen is a certain portion of the overhead will remain fixed, a certain portion will vary depending on the kind of activity. Now, what is really important for us from a cost accounting perspective is distribution of this overhead. How exactly now what you have to remember is the overhead is still an expense for you. This overhead cost that you're incurring, no matter whatever you do, no matter whatever activity that you try and carry out, you cannot avoid it. It is still a part and parcel of your activity. It is still a part and parcel of the activities that you're carrying out. So how do you go about distributing it? You have to distribute because you have to get this expense back. Okay? You have to distribute because you have to get this expense back. So overhead that cannot be charged directly to the price of a product or service. So you have to think of some ways to recover it. You're not able to tangibly quantify and say this cost that I'm incurring, it is against this specific activity. So another thing that you have to remember is it has to be distributed to the various departments. Okay? It has to be distributed among the various departments. So distribution among the various departments is very important in the case of overhead. Now, this activity of distributing the overhead among the various departments is called as departmentalization. I'll repeat that. The distribution of overhead to various departments is called as departmentalization. I'll repeat that. This activity of getting the cost back and by distributing among the different departments, this is called as departmentalization. Now, departmentalization, that is the distribution of overhead, you can carry out in two ways. One is allocation and the other is apportionment. I'll repeat that. It can be done in two ways. One is allocation and the other is apportionment. Now, let's talk about in detail what is meant by allocation and apportionment. Now, remember, you have to get the money back. Okay? So, overhead is still an expense for you, but you have to get the money back. So, how do you really go about getting the money back? That is what we will be discussing as a part of distribution. So, as a part of distribution, there are two ways that you can do this. One is allotment and the other is apportionment. Now, what do you mean by allotment? Now, what happens is the entire overhead, you're able to confidently say, this overhead I'm incurring as a result of such and such, so I will get the money from there. Okay? So in the case of allotment, what will happen is the complete overhead, it gets charged from a specific cost center. Okay? The complete overhead, it gets charged from a specific cost center. So that is called as allotment. Okay? That is called as allotment. So allotment, whenever we talk about allotment, we are talking about the complete overhead cost. Okay? Whenever we talk about allotment, we are talking about the complete overhead cost. And this one, it will be very easy to compute. Okay? Allotment, it is usually very easy to compute. Okay? It is easy to compute. And then, since you are getting the entire money based from a specific area, from a specific cost center, what will happen is you don't have to charge. You don't have to think of some basis to distribute this cost. Okay? So that is what happens in the case of allotment. So allotment, what will happen is you're able to charge the entire overhead against a specific activity. So I'll give you an example. Factory rent. In your factory, you're having only one product, and then you have to pay factory rent for it. So in such cases, what happens is that entire overhead cost you're able to charge against the product that you're manufacturing. Okay, so that's what happens in that case. But now we'll be talking about apportionment. So in the case of apportionment, what will happen is you're charging a portion of the cost to the cost center. So depending on the degree or depending on the extent to which you're enjoying the benefit, you will go about charging the cost. Okay, so that is what happens in the case of apportionment. So whenever we talk about apportionment, it usually deals with the portion of the cost. Okay, deals with, we are not talking about the complete overhead cost, we are only talking about a small segment of the overhead cost. Then another thing that you have to remember is whenever we talk about apportionment of cost, it is more complex in nature. Okay? It is more complex in nature. It is difficult to calculate. Okay? It is difficult to calculate. Also, whenever we carry out apportionment, we will always be carrying out the apportionment based on the benefit that is enjoyed. Okay? We will be always talking about, whenever we talk about apportionment, we will always be talking about the proportion of the benefit that is enjoyed. Okay, so I'll give you an example for this. Let's talk about HR. Okay, now you have one HR in your organization, and you are having two different products. You are having two different products. So what will happen is, for the HR, you have to pay salary, but the HR is not carrying out your production process directly. Okay? But your HR is still, a vital person or a vital role in your organization. So the remuneration that you're paying for the HR, that is a That is an overhead for you. So how do you distribute? So you could distribute based on the number of employees who are working in those product lines. So if product A is larger than product B, then what will happen is you will take more proportion of money from for the HR salary from product A than compared to product B. So that is what is meant by apportionment. So in the case of apportionment, what will happen is you will go about redistributing the money, you will go about charging the money depending or based on the benefit, the extent to which that you are enjoying the benefit. So that's what happens in the case of apportionment. But in the case of allotment, what happens is you're charging the money directly from a certain service sector. So that's what happens for allotment. So remember, distribution of overhead you can go about carrying out in two ways. One is allotment and the other is apportionment. I will stop my classes here for now. We will continue in the next session.